Hello and welcome to CLGS, the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies and Religion here at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. And welcome to today's Lavender Lunch, Trans-Biblical New Approaches to Interpretation and Embodiment in Scripture. We will have a conversation with three of the contributing authors. Before I introduce the introducer, just a few things I want to mention. One is that this event is being recorded and will be posted on our socials afterwards. We will not record, nor will we post the chat feature. So welcome again to CLGS, and I would now like to welcome and introduce our person who is hosting this, and that is Reverend Jakob Hero-Shaw. Jakob is the coordinator of the Trans Religious Roundtable here at the center and also faculty lead for the Trans Religious Cohort. So, Jakob, take it away.
Thank you all for being here. This is going to be a wonderful conversation. We'll be together for about an hour. And before we jump right in, I'm just going to introduce our speakers for today. And at the end, after the three of them have had a chance to share their presentations and talk about their work, we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So we'll start with Jay Marshall is professor of religious studies and affiliated faculty in women and gender studies at a state university in the Midwest of the U.S. Their contribution to Transbiblical is an essay called Captive Genders, Fugitive Flesh and Biblical Epistles, Trans Approaches to Ancient Apostles and Assemblies in the Afterlife of Enslavement and Imprisonment, and builds upon abolitionist writing and organizing by trans scholars and activists, and a growing body of biblical scholars engaging in critical carceral studies. In addition to Transbiblical, they are the author, editor, or co-editor of 12 books. Solo authored works include Appalling Bodies, Queer Figures Before and After Paul's Letters, and edited projects include After the Corinthian Women Prophets, Reimagining Rhetoric and Power, and Bodies on the Verge, Pauline Epistles. Oh, sorry, Queering Pauline Epistles. Dr. Marshall also serves as a founding co-editor with Melissa Wilcox of the completely fee-free and open access journal, QTR, a Journal of Trans and Queer Studies in Religion, and just completed their term as the founding chair of the Society of Biblical Literature's first ever Committee for LGBTQ plus Scholars and Scholarship. All right. Now, our next presenter is Melissa Harl-Selu. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Sorry, I should have checked ahead of time.
Yes, although I'll go third, actually.
What's that?
Yes, that's correct. I will go third, however.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll introduce you now, and then we'll switch up the order. She's Professor Emerita of Classical and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota. Her contribution to Transbiblical is called Considering the Body with the Gospel of Thomas, and builds upon her long-standing research interest in apocryphal texts like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Gospel of Thomas, and other Coptic language, liturgical, and hagiographical texts. In addition to Transbiblical, she is also the editor or co-editor of several other collections, including volumes produced in honor of Calvin J. Rotzel and Helmut Kotzer, and is recipient of a 3-year NEH grant to support the Digital Humanities Project Resurrecting Early Christian Lives, as well as a member and storyteller of Telling Queer History. She's been an influential voice for change within the Academy to support LGBTQIA voices, as well as a longtime foot soldier for many social justice causes, including opposing the Vietnam War as a CO, chairing her Presbyterian committee in solidarity with refugees from El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 1980s, and participating in Falcon Heights, We Can Do Better, in response to the police killing of Philando Castile in 2016. She works Isaiah, the Racial Justice Action Team, and the Sanctuary Solidarity Group through her home church, First Congregational Church of Minnesota, UCC. And our second presenter will be Eric A. Thomas, who is a professor, pastor, and public theologian whose research engages queer of color biblical criticism, Black studies, and theopoetics. Eric is the assistant professor of Bible at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in New York City and pastor of Siloam Presbyterian Church in Bedford Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. I don't know all my Brooklyn neighborhoods. His work invites us to imagine everyday embodiments of freedom, flourishing, and futures alongside communities for whom such pursuits are impeded by imperial Christianity and its attendant logics of heteronormativity, respectability, politics, and erotophobia. Eric is a graduate of Drew University, where he completed the PhD in New Testament with a concentration in Africana and Women and Gender Studies, and the Interdenominational Theological Center, where he completed his MDiv. He enjoys naps, spending quality time with his spouse Carlos, and Rottweiler puppy Zeus. All right. It is such an honor to have the three of you here with us, and I'll turn it over to Jay.
Thank you so much. Let's see if I can share screen. It's not letting me. Hold on one moment. It was working before. Here we go. Can folks see that all right? Okay. I just want to share the thanks of all the contributors as well as the co-editors of Trans Biblical, for CLGS for hosting, for Bernie and Jacob for the warm invite and welcome. It's a bit of an electronic homecoming for me as well as for Katie Valentine. And Melissa Harrell. The three of us are the triad who are co-editing this volume. And I got my PhD at the GTU, and I was in residence at PSR many, many years ago, just as in many ways CLGS was just getting off the ground. So there's all sorts of weird queer and trans temporalities happening here, not just the order of our presenters. But feeling that loop, and unfortunately feeling the loop of a great deal of my time when I was still living in Northern California, was when we were in the midst of another war of choice by the ruling minority in our country. So if you are watching this recording, this is happening in early March of 2026. And to not acknowledge the roiling crises that are happening in our country and the world at the same time as talking about this would be to sort of defeat the point of also a volume like this, which is about the past, but a lot about our present. And so what I'm going to try to do today is situate the project Transbiblical within various backgrounds and approaches that preceded it. Right. And I'm going to talk a bit about the co-authored introduction that I took the first crack at, and that Melissa and Katie and I kind of collaborated on. And in fact, how we chose to start the volume was with this kind of proclamation, exclamation description, which is that gender variation is as ancient as stories about creation. That such a sentence could be both obvious to some and contentious to many others is precisely why we need more transbiblical interpretation, and the animating force behind us gathering this work and thinking it's time for an edited volume like this. Biblical materials have always been more gender variable, more transitory, more expansive, more nonconforming than recent interpreters assume, and increasingly many interpreters shout and bully us about, right? So people respond in different ways. Popular responses are, in fact, to reclaim the past, biblical materials have also shown up in trans movements in different ways. We see people laying claim to the divine as described, for example, in Genesis 1, and say God is the original they, them. We now have a candidate for Senate in Texas who apparently has gotten in trouble from pearl clutching people on the right about describing God as non-binary. This is very much a Christian kind of conversation. Or the idea that maybe the first human was a primordial androgynous human, right? So trans movement and trans studies are much longer than the current panic has plainly manufactured by authoritarians, right? Indeed, fascists have long targeted the treatment, the research, and the community building for trans and other gender nonconforming folks. If one sign, again, of unfortunate historic loops, one of the first times that the Nazi Party in Germany burned books, maybe the most famous picture of book burning happened, the famous Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin in 1933. This may make us give pause anytime people want to eliminate literature or knowledge about gender, sexuality, and embodiment, especially about gender nonconformity, gender expansion, gender variability, and transness, right? And so we've been through these panics before and forms of persecution. This is why one of the arguments that we make in the introduction is that we need transness, especially to think about history, to think about the past, right? So unlike claims that maybe, oh, it's anachronistic to think in terms of a category like trans, right? That we're going to make an argument that actually using a term like this is actually more suited and more attuned to thinking about other times and places. It helps us better capture, right, the variety and the complexity of gender, of sexuality, of practices, of embodiment, and how people talk about it, which is not to say that people and practices of the past are identical to, say, trans or non-binary people now, but to avoid imposing our narrow and rigid categories on the past. So trans is in some ways then more a category for analysis. It's not primarily or only a category for identification in a volume like this. It's definitely a point of identity for many of the authors, but many of them also take up this idea that transness helps us with materials from other times and places. It also encourages us to not assume and project cisness on other times and places, as if most or even only certain people are unchanging, or as if gender is firm or fixed or clear for most people. In fact, thinking about transness helps us again see the variety, the dynamism, the complexity of gender in other times and places, which is also another way of saying that what transbiblical is building upon is not terribly new. It's not terribly different, right? So we see ourselves in conversation with projects like, say, Transhistorical, which is talking about pre-modern figures. And the editors of that volume think of transness as anytime there's structures of meaning for gendered experience, you're going to find people or maybe practices that are outliers to these structures. So any culture that makes structures for meaning about gendered experience, you're going to find outliers to these structures of meaning. And these outliers, by the way, not only is it not only new, but it's long been religious and then also emphatically Christian. So if you're tuning in or you're watching this video because you are inside of Christian communities and traditions, and you think this is a new thing, this is a centuries old way of being Christian, as volumes like Alicia Spencer Hall and Blake Gutz's trans and genderqueer subjects in medieval hagiography highlight. And their way of thinking about gender in the past and thinking about transness and genderqueerness is anytime there's a norm of gender, there are transgressions. Indeed, one of the reasons why we have norms is in order to call certain things or certain people transgressions or transgressors. And if we begin to trace these things, we see longer and more distinguished and more variable and more creative and troubling and confounding religious and even specifically Christian practices of gender, right? And indeed, we situate our volume within the history of trans biblical interpreters that have come before, right? So Justin Sabiatanis, who is also based at PSR for many, many years, or Virginia Mollenkott's Omnigender volume, or the great volume that was co-written by Teresa Hornsby and Darren Guest, or Max Strassfeld, one of our colleagues, in rabbinic studies. It's important to kind of recognize, though, and this volume focuses specifically on Christian practices and Christian ways of thinking about scripturality, right? Both because Jewish scholars and communities have been ahead of their Christian counterparts, and also because those doing the most damage now are those who are most loudly claiming the term Christian, laying claim to these traditions. And internally, you might want to say that that's not authentically Christian, but it's also, frankly, a conversation that needs to happen among and between Christian folks, Christian denominations, Christian communities, about what type of Christians you will be, right? Which means that what approach you take to Scripture is going to matter. It's going to indicate what type of person you are, again, whether you are a Christian or not. But this volume focuses more on the New and Second Testament, as well as scriptures that belong to Christianity, than the canons for Judaism, because of this the greater weight that it bears in our culture and our time. So we think it's important to focus on the distinctly Christian parts or portions of the scriptures. But we do feature really important scholars like Joy Layden, who wrote this incredible book, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. And she wrote this really beautiful, pedagogical, kind of really accessibly oriented piece about wondering, what does it mean to read any biblical text from a trans experience, from a trans lens? And Layden was thinking about, oh, I wrote this entire book, but I don't think I've actually described what this approach is. So Layden lands on and narrates in one of the opening chapters of the Transbiblical volume this concept of trans experience from her point of view, which is something that actually not only trans or non-binary or gender expansive people can have, but anytime you as a person has some kind of slippage between yourself, your experience of yourself, and the identifying defining roles and categories that we have been assigned, right? Anytime you failed, if someone told you to act like a man, or be a lady, be a good girl, right? Or when we talk to younger people, we use this phrase now, little man, which is a more recent way of talking. But what kind of gendered work are we doing there? And is someone calling us out, in fact, because something that we've done is no longer fitting the roles and categories to which we've been assigned? If you have any experience of that, you're having a trans experience, Joy Layden would argue, right? And so this means that we can also pay attention to texts that aren't just strictly about, say, for example, transitions of gender, right? So one of the examples that she brings to us is the example of Jacob in Genesis, right? And he has the assignment as the second son, so it's about gender, but he resists that, right? And tries to play that. He feels as if he should have the blessing and the inheritance that's assigned and given to his brother, right? Which is not to say that Jacob is transgender. Jacob of Genesis, right? That is, there's Jacobs on the call who have other things to say, I'm sure, right? But that thinking about trans experience helps us to kind of see more capaciously how people function and operate in the real world, right? And what gender does to us, what categories do to us. So this is just one of many approaches that Transbiblical is trying to feature. Another, which is in some ways asking a very similar question, Rebecca Weigel, who's a scholar of New Testament and late antiquity, right? And she's going to argue in a very different direction than Dr. Layden does, right? Whereas trans experience is something that anyone can have, Weigel's project is really about trying to figure out, if we're going to do historical comparative work, how can I find a trans person in the past? And she narrows it down to one criterion, right? And so this is the most texty of the slides, and I apologize for that. All studies show that the more words you put on a slide, less that people retain. But the specificity is important to capture here, right? So if it's a person who seeks or desires to transition from a category of sexed or gendered intelligibility, right? Or if they're working very, very hard to transition potentially to unintelligibility, right? They're trying to tell an intelligible story with their body, and they're trying to move from one category to another category. Or if in the attempt to do this, right, they realize that they're actually moving in a way that's unintelligible because of the inadequacy of their culture's categories for them, Weigel will say, bing, bang, boom. I can talk about someone in the past as transgender, right? As a trans person, even if this is a modern American English word, right? As are almost all the words we use, unless we are obnoxious preachers, right? Dropping in the Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew for your audiences. We use American English idioms all the time. And of course, marriage meant something very different in the ancient world than it does now, but I still say someone got married in the ancient world, right? So if we're going to use a category like trans, which we can, to talk about the past, what can we do, right? So we have someone like Layden who says, actually anybody, and I think she's banking on, this is an experience that almost, if we're honest with ourselves, all humans have. And Weigel comes along, two different trans women, two different really smart scholars thinking about biblical texts, landing on really different positions about what should we do when we encounter biblical texts. Right? And so when Weigel's argument, actually there's that threefold saying where Jesus talks about three different types of eunuchs in Matthew 19:12. Weigel wants to say, that first one isn't trans, that second one isn't trans, but that the third one, the one who makes themselves a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, they're moving from one category of sex or gender intelligibility to another. Right? She wants to argue, that castrated person, that eunuch, that fits the criterion. But also maybe surprisingly, counterintuitively for some, when Paul's arguing very carefully and very vexedly in the middle chapters of 1 Corinthians, that's better to not have sex at all, to withdraw from sex than to get married, he's also arguing in terms of a shift from one category of sex or gendered intelligibility, that is in some ways a trans shift. This is all to say, though, that there's many, many other ways of thinking about what trans-biblical interpretation can be and what it is. It was very, very important to us when we conceived of this volume. It was in growing out of several special sessions where we biblical scholars as nerds get together and talk about what's happening in the field. And what was happening in the field is a lot of folks were beginning to engage with trans studies, with trans movements, with trans communities of accountability, were coming out themselves as trans or gender nonconforming or non-binary. And we said, it's really important that we don't write a book that tells the one way of doing, because that's actually not what the field was. That's not what trans people are like. That's not what our experiences of gender are like, or the histories of gender are like. And so if you have the chance to pick up this volume, it's still on discount. It came out less than a year ago now. You'll see that some folks are really interested in connecting with transcestors, right? This idea that we have trans ancestors, or that other biblical figures could be seen as non-binary, like Jael or Mordecai. Or is it most important that we critically reflect upon our own experience? And I bet you Melissa Harl-Selly will tell us some about that. But I think we want to call your attention to one of the claims that Justin Sabiatanis makes in a really lovely chapter on interpreting the Good Samaritan story through a trans approach, which is that for many of us, the goal of trans hermeneutics, which is the $10 word for biblical interpretation, trans biblical interpretation, the goal has to be to liberate people from the tyranny of gender norms. And one way of doing that is getting us to think about our histories and our histories with these texts differently. And to tell us some more about this kind of approaches that we might take, I invite my colleague and one of the fabulous contributors to this volume, Eric Thomas, to take on over. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Jay, and good afternoon to everyone. And again, thanks to our organizers for bringing this conversation together. I'm going to share a presentation on our chapter, which is Grace, Truth, and Danger toward an Africana Queer Transfiguration of John 1:14. Basically, our argument is Black trans lives matter, and I can stop sharing my screen and go on to the next person here. But I mean, that is the point. This comes from the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen Christ's glory, glory as of the Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And we continue to say that that is a grace, truth, and a danger when we think alongside of the lived experiences of Black and brown transgender folks, not only in the US, but around the diasporas. And so, to Jay's point of acknowledging this moment in history, we'd also extend that to trans and non-binary and queer folk in Palestine, Iran, in the Sudan, in Puerto Rico, in Venezuela, at the borders, and all these places around the world for which queerness and transness are additional dangers of the precarity of those situations. And so we wanted to think more precisely about the connections within Blackness and transness in the midst of ongoing Black and trans death, and against the backdrop of the rapid institutionalization of trans studies. So as trans studies has already emerged and is emerging, we wanted to bear witness to Black and brown trans experience and trans people of color experience globally as we took up this interpretation. And this is a picture of Minnie Khumalo, who is my co-author. And I just wanted to make sure that I brought her image into the conversation. In this chapter, article, we're arguing that the Johannine Jesus is constantly in transition. He goes from the word to the flesh, to the I am statements, to the crucified teacher, the resurrected savior. We note that John the Baptist outs Jesus and dead names him in the first chapter as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, basically activating his trajectory to the cross. So as soon as we understand Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, in I think chapter 1, verse 29, every step that Jesus takes in the Gospel of John is bringing him closer and closer to the cross and crucifixion. And similarly, Black and brown trans folk activating their trajectory toward life and life more abundantly do so at the risk of death. And so there's a discussion here about trans necropolitics in the chapter. And like Jesus, they defiantly proceed in their own iterations of grace, truth, and danger. And we kind of come to the conclusion that care and community and solidarity is needed, such that all lives will matter when Black trans lives matter. And so we're thinking together with Justin Tanis, and for the YouTube and the recording, you can pause this and read this quote. We're thinking together with Marquise Bay, who offers us a theorization of tranaflesh, which we thought was really, really neat for the incarnational aspect of the Johannine Gospel. But particularly this last sentence, tranaflesh is an otherwise way of being that exceeds the categorizing logics of race and gender, that exceeds identities and disorganizes around subversive world building. So this is not just do you identify as, but it's also transing as a methodology and also as an intervention. And so we think with our transcestors, we have Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. We're also thinking alongside this kind of transgender tipping point, evidenced by Laverne Cox, and also our friends from the series Pose, as we're thinking about varieties of trans experience, as we're talking about trans temporalities between the past, the present, and imagining futures. And we have Cece McDonald, who this quote is from the article, that's saying that while it seems that RuPaul's Drag Race and Pose and Legendary and other kinds of commercialized acknowledgments of trans lives and experiences are a good thing, they are progress in a certain kind of way, that this tipping point is bringing an unsettling rate of violence toward trans women that is even more so now than ever. And so we're thinking with, and I think that in the essay, there is a listing. The Human Rights Coalition provides a list of those who have been killed uh, due to intimate partner violence and community violence in the trans and non-binary community. And so we named those names from 2019. But of course, the Human Rights Coalition says in almost 400 cases of fatal violence against transgender and gender nonconforming people tracked since 2013, 70% were against Black people. Nearly 60% were Black trans women. I think that number is low. And 71% of cases involved gun violence. That gun violence also includes what happens when you call 911 and how the police arriving on the scene misrecognize the situation to the detriment of the trans victims. We talk about this concept of ukulanganisa. I wish many were here to say this properly. But this idea of like I am because we are, this idea that we work together to be able to interrupt transphobia and erotophobia to offer mutual aid and care and solidarity that is radical, right? And so we showcase that in the I am statements of Jesus. And we note that not only does Jesus become the bread of life and the gate and the shepherd and so on and so forth, that all of the things that Jesus transitions into are things that benefit the community. And so I invite you to go back and look at the Johannine I am statements and bear that out. And we compare that to the ways that the transgender action revolutionaries, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, and other movements, the Movement for Black Lives, do the same thing to offer resources to the community. And so we're saying that in our Africana queer presentation, interpretation, Jesus I am statements are more than metaphors, right? They're acts of radical care that are not confined by straight time, nor are they defined by his dead naming. So again, radical solidarity is what we're calling for here. Just as a Johannine reading of the crucifixion is the death-defying act of resurrection, we're saying the same thing for the transgender community. Not so much that we're raised from the dead, but that we insist on life in this life, as opposed to the life, thereafter. And so we're noticing that the transfiguring of Jesus doesn't conform to a singular being in the Gospel of John. John is very different. John kind of queers the synoptic Jesuses, right? John's Jesus becomes a different Jesus who becomes different things at different times, even though his time, most of the time, has not come. So one of the things that we're still waiting for is the second coming of Jesus, right? And those differences in context breed and overcome the dangers. India Moore, who we might recognize from Pose, in 2019, when she was given Elle magazine's cover of the year, she wore these earrings. If you look at the earrings in this picture, they were the pictures of the ones that were lost in 2019 of Black, trans, and non-binary siblings that were lost in 2019. She says that a life that requires bravery is not free. And so she accepts, they accept this award in honor of the truth that the best award and the best award we all deserve is to be able to get home safe. So we end with protect Black trans women, protect Black and brown trans life. And with that, I'll say thank you and stop sharing. And introduce my colleague, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Eric and Jay, and organizers and the audience, and our co-editor Katie, who's here. So I wrote, as we were told by Jacob, an article on the Gospel of Thomas, and I've discovered that not everybody knows very much about the Gospel of Thomas. And so I thought I'd spend a couple minutes just talking about that text, which did not make it into our New Testaments, and a little bit about how my readings of Thomas have influenced me as a transgender reader of scripture and related texts. Like most books we call Gospels, Thomas focuses on Jesus. More specifically, Thomas presents Jesus as the spokesperson for divine wisdom. The Gospel includes more than 100 statements from Jesus, and these are presented without any narrative framework. Where Jesus might be, when he might be speaking, and even who his audience might be, are left unsaid. Jesus' words come in the form of parables, proverbs, admonitions, and ethical exhortations, and many of his statements are quite perplexing. Indeed, the gospel opens by instructing us to search for the life-giving meaning of these mysterious words. What Thomas omits, at least in contrast with the New Testament gospels, are stories of confrontations with demons, healings of the sick, nature miracles, or visions of a violent apocalypse. Even the physical sufferings, death, and resurrection of Jesus are left unmentioned. Correspondingly, Thomas has no discussion of rituals like baptism or the Lord's Supper that other Christians connect so closely to Jesus' bodily experience. Other contrasts with the New Testament Gospels include its lack of interest in discovering messianic prophecies in the Jewish scriptures, or in meditating on the fate of Jerusalem and its temple. Instead, the Jesus of Thomas calls us to intense self-scrutiny, to discovery of our inner selves as linked to the immaterial divine spirit, the heavenly place of life and light. This emphasis on our interior identities and truths has been intriguing and potentially liberating for transgender readers such as myself. In my chapter of our book, I face some of the implications of Thomas's strong valuation of our inner, spiritual, and thus immaterial selves when contrasted with the complicated experiences of trans and other gender variant people with regard to our physical bodies and how our embodiment is viewed and judged by other people. In previous publications, I have stressed the strongly negative view of our material existence that Thomas manifests, a perspective that appeals to me somewhat, along with the concentration of attention on our inner spiritual selves. In this new chapter, I give space to the reality that other trans, non-binary, or genderqueer individuals have rather more positive experiences of their bodies. There can also be significant variations in these feelings across categories of race, age, class, and location. My chapter also seeks to show how closely some of Thomas's signature value system has in common with New Testament texts like the letters of Paul or the Gospel of John. These texts share Thomas's themes of contrast between flesh and spirit, body and soul, above and below, light and darkness. John's Gospel, of course, adopted the biographical framework of its predecessor Gospel authors, but nevertheless gives many indications that, quite like Thomas, salvation, whatever that means, involves recognition of our divine connection, born of spirit, not flesh, and our union with God need not wait indefinitely for some violent divine intervention in history, such as Paul looks forward to happening any minute now. Furthermore, in connection with what Dr. Thomas just mentioned, in John's Gospel, Jesus embodies various versions of ways to reach God. Jesus is the gate, the way, the door. Also in Thomas, Jesus is our guide to finding our inner divine truths and thus achieving eventual union, truly reunion with the divine light and life. And I'd like to close by just reading aloud my last paragraph from the book, if that's okay. for a trans individual living contingently in their physical embodiment. It seems that the Jesus of Thomas recognizes that humans of any, all, or no gender could be on a path toward enlightenment, self-understanding, and, if so desired, escape from the limitations of material existence. While alive in this created mortal plane, so Thomas would suggest, any and all human bodies struggle with their physicality. Female bodies more than male, to be sure, disabled, differently gendered folks, and racialized disabled folks even more, but all may and likely do struggle nonetheless. And so, in light of Thomas's rendering of inevitable bodily struggle and the human quest to ascertain our spiritual essence, the non-normative, unusual, possibly monstrous-seeming bodies that convey trans and gender variant folks about in this world may ultimately not appear to be quite so alien. None of us lives a single-issue life, says Audre Lorde. Perhaps, through our shared versions of embodiment, we, the gender diverse, as with the variously disabled, may offer ourselves to be simply seen and, one hopes, to be viewed positively. We would thus embody some of the more accessible and self-aware exemplars of living in and through the challenges, confusions, and joys that must be faced and experienced for anyone striving to be authentically human, body and soul. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our amazing presenters. We have a little more than 15 minutes now that we can have some discussion. So I before we move into the discussion, I just want to make sure that everyone saw that Katie Valentine put in the chat the link to get the book with a 40% discount. So that is there in the chat. And now we're gonna kind of to shift into our discussion time. And for those of you who have joined us after the beginning, I just wanted to let you know that this is going to be posted on our socials on YouTube and Facebook later. The chat will not be posted. So we are inviting you to, you can unmute yourself, you can turn your camera on if you're comfortable doing that. I see most people have their cameras off. And go ahead and if anyone has any questions.
This
Katie.
is Katie. Yeah, I'm one of the co-editors, so I'm in the enviable position of getting to ask fellow colleagues questions. But I'm curious for really for anyone, for Eric, Melissa, or Jay, how you might be continuing this this work in the future, either in life or in scholarship and writing.
Continuing to read along with writers like C. Riley Snorton and Marquise Bay, continuing to pay attention to what is happening in our communities, what is happening globally, and to the extent that those things kind of inspire looking at scriptures in a new kind of way. That's what we're up to. It will be interesting, given this introduction, to look at the First Testament a little bit more closely, beyond perhaps Joseph, but for other possibilities of trans-biblical readings.
I mean, well, clearly it's a time of great distress for many of us, probably everybody, but in certain ways for trans people. Yes, I'm continuing to write on the Gospel of Thomas, and I write as a trans person and with trans eyes, I guess, and listen with trans ears. And so my readings of Thomas won't be universal, of course, as any of ours might not be. But I hope that they help uncover things that even before I had the self-confidence to openly read with a transgender lens, I didn't notice things in the text. And I think we all can learn and grow. By the way, I need to greet and thank a friend that I see here, Bea Wells. Hi.
Professor Melissa, a question for you. I know I'm not suggesting you're an expert in canonicity, but I'm curious, of course, the Gospel of Thomas doesn't make its way into the canon. Is that related in any way, might you guess, to issues of what we consider gender identity or the imputation that somehow the depiction of Jesus wasn't, I don't want to use the word, but orthodox, or, I mean, as you read it as a scholar, trans person.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's not trying to do the same thing as the narrative gospels. And it, as I hinted, it isn't interested in the Paulinist notion of the Christ being a suffering Messiah and so on, and the implication that we need to be martyred or we need to suffer somehow, or that we should celebrate these kinds of things in some sense. Even our rituals, the Last Supper, baptism into death and new life, all those things have this subtext of violence that Thomas doesn't touch on. Also, I think it might be read as a not just different from the narrative gospels, but having a different object, which is to ask us as individuals to think about ourselves more deeply. Not that it's anti-community, because there's a lot of ethical stuff about how you treat your siblings and so on. But it's not carrying that particular cross or that weight, so to speak. That can be explained in different ways. I think traditionally people have explained it as, well, it's a rejection of all that stuff, and it might be. But it might also be, hey, there's more to Jesus than that. Let's think about him as a philosopher, as a guide, as a guru, so to speak, and spiritual enlightenment. And when I've talked about Thomas to public audiences, there's, I think, almost without exception, someone will want to come up and talk about Buddhism or South Asian notions of spirituality. And it's fascinating, possibly relevant, that, of course, the indigenous Christians of the Indian subcontinent looked to Thomas as their apostle. There's sadly no direct connection that we can find as serious historians between the Gospel of Thomas and India, but still, it's worth mentioning.
Thank you.
Jay, were you gonna also talk about your next?
I mean, it's going a lot of different directions. If other folks have a question ready, I'm happy to kind of cede the time there.
Go ahead.
I'll just start by saying that I think while it's a really daunting time to be alive, it's also an incredible time to be in community with trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people and trans studies. I mean, the one of the instincts or one of the things that we noticed that necessitated first the special sessions on trans-biblical hermeneutics at the SBL meeting, but then the volume was the rate of change and kind of the creation of resources like the TSQ journal, and I'm happy to add the QTR journal. So I think about, I'm thinking a lot about affect right now, and speaking of feelings, right? Is there a way, Hill Malatino writes about this in both side affects and in trans care, that like maybe that gender is a lot about supplication, that we're looking for others to confer our desired recognition. And is that maybe also why we keep turning back to our scriptures, whether we are Christian or non-Christian, whether we are Jewish, as some of the folks are commenting? in the chat this kind of acknowledgement of our situatedness, um, and that might mean also having to deal with the trauma and like kind of the continued perpetual or accelerating awful that we're living with. Um, One of the things that I see happening that I think is really interesting for thinking about in terms of New Testament texts, because I'm, for lack of a better word, like a scholar of those texts, is this historicization of cisness that I briefly alluded to, um, that we need to work to decenter presumptive cisness, right? So instead of looking in the past, looking for transcestors and looking for other people who are like us, other exceptions, why shouldn't we also just historicize how like very unique the ways of assuming cisness are, right? And Beans Veloci has got a new book about this, but in some ways we see Joy Layden is thinking a little bit about this, but so is Rafe Neese in Rabbinics. If you're interested in kind of again in the Jewish studies angle and rabbinics, there's not one, there's not two, there's three really great volumes from just the last few years. Max Strassfeld's book on Trans Talmud, Rafe Neese, as well as Sarah Lev, L-E-V, have these incredible books that really most people don't just happen to fit the category they were assigned, Veloci argues, right? That there's this whole apparatus that's churned along in the background, willfully ignored, that make us look that way. And I wonder about that and the unstable masculinities and the unstable genders that are all over the place in the Gospels and the epistles and the apocalypses, that later get canonized. Um, there's very few viri in the ancient world, right? And to kind of recognize that there's so many folks who are as constructed, right? When Susan Stryker kind of talks about that. Um, but there's one more kind of like one more plug for another kind of work. Jules Gill Peterson has a kind of really slim book from last year called A Short History of Transmisogyny. And if we're thinking about historical duration, that might be very helpful. It reminds me of how Bernadette Bruton argued like decades ago about female homoeroticism. So that rather than like the move that many scholars want to make, which is about historical interruption and saying the ancient way of thinking about homoeroticism is so different than the modern one. But if we start factoring in minoritized gender, women and other people who move towards the bottom of pyramidal structures of power, there are maybe less twists and turns. There might be less ruptures and breaking points. And I think Gil Peterson is kind of making an argument about this, that transmisogyny might be older than our terms transness, and that might help us to kind of think differently about our politics, as well as our history. So I think about all those things when I'm thinking about what might be next, as well as thinking about carcerality instead of collections, as our example of collective work, of care, of mutual aid, when we read the letters that we now call Paul's. So there's a cluster of things to kind of latch onto, if you like.
Thank you. We have I want to ask a kind of practical question. We've got a couple of students here from the Trans Religious Leadership Cohort, which is a program for folks who are studying for different types of religious leadership in all kinds of traditions. I always like to give a little plug for that. So the folks in the cohort are really doing in-person engagement with faith communities, and they all identify as non-binary or genderqueer or trans in some way. So what I'm wondering for people who are just stepping into their leadership identities, what kind of message would you like from your scholarship to be something that can inspire, trans folks who are working in-person real live communities outside of academia? They're in academia too, but do you have any words of wisdom?
I'm looking at Eric.
I, you know, I think that this is invitational. I think that transbiblical, this volume, might be a thing that says we did it and you can do it too, and that your readings are valid, And here are many different ways, kind of like a cookbook, many different ways to do that. I am really, really inspired by Michael Joseph Brown, who is our ancestor right now, who at the end of his book, Blackening of the Bible, kind of tried to make a case for including queer and transgender kind of perspectives in African American biblical interpretation. And he says if we had to wait until these people got into the guild, we may never hear their voices. And so that I think is an invitation for us to read scriptures in community, to read literature in community, to read about activists and activism in community, and develop our own ways of reading and being to create our own volumes.
Thank
Come
you.
join us.
Yeah.
The floor is open.
I was just thinking about when like I was in seminary at the same time as some of the folks who I know here, and how little there was back then of this kind of scholarship, and just what an incredible blessing it is to have so many options now of what to read and study and the possibilities for what's next. So thank you all for that.
I think also in terms of that question, Jacob,
Mhm.
trans visibility and trans vulnerability go hand in hand, as is also mentioned early in our book, I think on the first page. And bravery is needed, authenticity to the extent that we are able to stay safe and employed in some cases, of course. So I have the odd advantage of being retired. So I don't have a chair of a department or a dean who wonders, why are you writing that stuff? I have that freedom. Not everybody has that kind of freedom. But to the extent it took a while for me to be brave enough to do something to accept Katie and Jay's invitation years ago now to appear on that first panel on trans hermeneutics. Really? Yeah. Okay. But I think it was a wonderful opportunity for me, and I hope others here will respond to similar kinds of chances that they have to be themselves in public and provide the plus that we provide to community, I would hope.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely plan on this volume two as not being the final word, but like as a gathering point and a way to kind of spin people out. But I'd also just encourage everyone to do it, to go, like to have the sense of urgency and energy. Um, and that some of the work in here was a product of that, and like folks have had to shift what they do for a living and their time and their attention to other things to survive, right? Because the landscape in universities and theological schools and seminaries, as is in pulpits, are dynamic and fraught, and incredibly hierarchical, asymmetrical, and precarious. So you don't know how long you have to do this, but what you do could make an impact that will outlive the amount of time you keep doing it. So you have to do it as soon as and like we hope that this is a way in, right? And whatever is that thing that is doing, and it's like, thank you, Melissa, for kind of calling to like the visibility as well as vulnerability, right? So we're in a month that we close with Trans Day of Visibility. It's also my favorite is Trans Day of Snack, right? So like if visibility is not possible for you, take that, like what can you do to gather with other people and support them, and to support each other, to support the precarious folks, the more precarious folks than you, nearby you, and forget, like sometimes the radical thing we could do is to show care and to give aid and to just share the snack, right? Rather than demand people perform something for you or show up in a particular way, right? And Transbiblical as a volume isn't demanding that you do your engagement with scriptures a particular way. and show up in the world a particular way. It shows you that there's many ways of doing that. And so a month like this reminds me of that. And so if visibility is your jam, and I'm grateful for you doing it, then awesome sauce, but also snack.
You're
Thank
making
you.
my tummy wake up here, Jay. Oh.
I just shared once again the link and the full title so that everybody can get the book at it's 40% off, I think. And I just want to thank you all so much for your incredible scholarship. Thank you for being here with us. Any last burning questions as we get ready to close, in case there's one person who's holding on for the last minute? All right. Well, how do we? Yes, Bernie just put in the chat as well to go to the CLGS website for upcoming events. Do you want to give the little spiel, Bernie?
Yeah, I would like to give a spiel for our 19th. We have two major lectures every year, and this year will be our 19th annual CLGS John Boswell lecture. We just published the first of what will be 2 volumes of the Boswell lectures. We also will be publishing in the next year some Harkness lectures. In any event, please join us. This is online for Bishop Tonya Rawls speaking on April 16 at 4 p.m. You can use that QR code or go to our website. Bishop will be speaking on Melanin, the Good, the Bad, and the Sacred. And that's on Thursday, April 16, 4 p.m. You need to register for it, and you can do that with the QR code or go to clgs.org. So please join us for that as well. And a double thank you to our presenters, Professors Melissa, Eric, and Jay. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you everyone for being a part of this CLGS Lavender Lunch.
Thank you all.